Brendan Ashworth slid his wedding ring across the kitchen counter, like he was returning a borrowed pen. 11 years. 11 years of early mornings and quiet loyalty, of eating crackers and peanut butter during the lean quarters, of staying up past midnight talking through every failure like it was just another problem they'd solve together. And this was how it ended. A small gold circle on a granite surface and a name, Katrina. He didn't look Madeleine Forsythe in the eye when he said it. He looked somewhere, just past her left shoulder, the coward's geography of a man who has already made his decision and needs to deliver the message without absorbing the impact. If you're watching from somewhere in Canada right now, drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story reaches, and if you're new to Ivory Secrets, please subscribe and hit that bell. You will not want to miss a single moment of what comes next. The woman Brendan had chosen was named Katrina Vale. Madeleine found this out not from him, but from a text that arrived 4 minutes after the front door closed behind him. A message from her closest friend, Corinna, who had seen them together at a restaurant in the Distilleries District 2 weeks before, and had spent 14 days drafting and deleting the warning she was only now finally sending. I'm so sorry. I didn't know how. I should have told you sooner. Madeleine read the text once. She set the phone face down on the counter beside the ring. She stood in the kitchen of the Rosedale house, the house her grandfather bought in 1971 and left to her, in a clause so precise it had taken 3 lawyers 6 months to fully decode. And she looked at the ring, and she looked at the window, and she looked at the November light falling through the backyard maple, which had gone the deep red it always went in the last weeks of autumn, before everything stripped bare. She did not cry, not yet. She picked up the ring, held it for one breath, and set it in the ceramic bowl on the windowsill, where she kept garden keys and loose change. Then she put the kettle on. This was who Madeleine was. People who didn't know her well sometimes mistook it for coldness. The people who did know her understood it was the opposite. She felt everything, completely, but she had learned from watching her grandfather navigate loss and complexity that feelings needed a container. You didn't perform them on the surface. You let them do their work underneath, where they were actually useful. Her grandfather's name was Alistair Forsythe. If you lived in Toronto, you almost certainly didn't recognize that name, which was entirely by design. Alistair had spent 55 years building one of the largest private real estate and investment portfolios in the country, while simultaneously ensuring that no profile was ever written about him. No award publicly accepted, no mention appeared in any financial journal or society column. Anonymity, he used to tell Madeleine during their long walks along the Rosedale Valley ravine, is not weakness. Often it is the most sophisticated power available to a person. He had raised her after her parents' marriage collapsed and her mother relocated abroad when Madeleine was 11. He had raised her in this same house, over long dinners and harder conversations, teaching her to read contracts and landscapes and people, teaching her the difference between building something that lasts and building something that only looks like it lasts. He had died 4 years ago, leaving behind a will that had required those 3 lawyers in 6 months and 2 follow-up meetings before anyone involved felt they fully understood it. She had known broadly what he left her. She had not understood the full scale. She hadn't needed to. She was living quietly. She was happy. She had married a man she genuinely believed in. She called Walter Finch the morning after Brendan left. Walter had been her grandfather's solicitor for 30 years and her own for the past 5. A trim, silver-haired man in his mid-60s who operated out of an office on Bay Street with the unhurried precision of someone who has witnessed enough crises to know which ones are actual crises and which are simply life insisting on being looked at. "I need to come in," Madeleine said when he answered. "I think it's time I understood everything, all of it." A measured pause. "I've been expecting this call," he said, "not because I predicted this specific circumstance, but because your grandfather always believed you would know when the time was right." "He said that?" "He said, and I'm quoting precisely," Walter replied, Madeleine will phone when she's stopped protecting other people from the truth and is ready to use it. His words, not mine. She arrived at his Bay Street office the following morning. She sat across from him at the long conference table, and he opened the first of 3 folders. The number he read aloud. The actual current valuation, fully audited through the previous fiscal year, made her set down her coffee cup with a small, quiet click. "That's considerably more than I understood," she said. "Your grandfather was a patient investor," Walter said. "He also had an extraordinary instinct for what this city was going to need before the city knew it needed it. 55 years of that. Compounded. Yes, it is considerably more." Then he opened the second folder. "There are aspects of this I need to walk you through carefully," he said, "because they relate directly to your current situation." Madeleine straightened in her chair. "Go ahead." What followed was the part she had not known. What followed rearranged the furniture of reality in ways she was still absorbing 3 hours later when she walked back out onto Bay Street into the November air. Brendan Ashworth's firm, the urban development company he had built over the past 9 years and spoke about, with the reverence other men reserved for their firstborn children, had received 3 critical injections of early-stage capital that had kept it operating through 2 market contractions. Capital that Brendan had always attributed to a group of private investors he called his foundational backers, people he'd found through his network, people who'd believed in him early and given him room to prove it. Those investors operated through a vehicle called Greywood Capital Partners. Greywood Capital Partners was a subsidiary of a trust. The trust's sole beneficiary was Madeleine Forsythe. She had been funding his company, not directly, not knowingly in any specific sense. She had known her grandfather's trust maintained various investment vehicles and had never examined their individual positions in detail. But her money, her grandfather's money, carefully structured through layers of holding entities, had been flowing invisibly into the foundation of everything Brendan believed he had assembled through personal talent and grit and sheer relentless will. She stood on Bay Street and thought, he looked me in the eye and said I hadn't grown with him. He said I was still the same woman he'd married, like that was a failure. She stood there for another full minute. Then she hailed a cab and went home. She sat with the first 2 folders for 3 days. On the 4th day, Walter called her. "There's something else," he said. "I've been researching since you phoned." "Tell me." "Katrina Vale," he said. "Her family name on her mother's side is Hargrove. Her maternal grandfather was a man named Reginald Hargrove." Madeleine said nothing. She waited. 31 years ago, Walter continued, your grandfather and Reginald Hargrove were co-investors in a mixed-use development on the eastern waterfront. Before the area became what it is now, at the time it was a significant gamble, and both families had substantial exposure. What happened? Reginald was bought out of the partnership 14 months before the project completed. He received fair market value at the time of the buyout. It appeared clean. But the project then appreciated dramatically, well beyond projections, and Reginald's family received none of that upside. Madeleine pressed her back against the chair. He was moved out at precisely the right moment. He died believing he had been deliberately maneuvered out of what should have been a generational return, Walter said. His daughter grew up believing the same. And his granddaughter built her entire adult life around correcting it, Madeleine said. That is my reading of the situation, Walter said carefully. She thanked him. She hung up. She sat in the grandfather's study, his bookshelves still on the walls, his old desk lamp still on the corner of the desk, and looked at the photograph she kept there. Alistair at 60, standing somewhere on the waterfront, squinting into summer light, looking like a man with no interest whatsoever in being photographed. Did you know? She said to the photograph. The photograph offered nothing back. But the question sat in the room with her, solid and real and heavy. Because if Reginald Hargrove had been right, if Alistair had known the zoning approvals were coming when he structured that buyout, then Katrina Vale wasn't simply the woman who had taken Madeleine's husband. She was someone who had inherited a wound she hadn't chosen and spent 2 decades converting that wound into strategy. Because strategy is what capable people do when they feel they have been left with no other recourse. Madeleine called Corinna. Corinna Marsh had been her closest friend for 12 years, since they'd lived in the same building near Spadina during graduate school. She worked in arts philanthropy now and knew everyone in Toronto's professional world in the way that people do, when they are genuinely interested in other people and also remarkably good at their jobs. She also had the rare skill of being able to engineer an encounter without making it look engineered. "I need to be in the same room as Katrina Vale," Madeleine said, "without it looking like I arranged it." A brief pause. "There's a gala Thursday. The Harbourfront Arts Foundation. Her firm is a sponsor. I'm on the host committee." "Put me near her table." "Madeleine," Corinna's voice went softer. "What exactly are you doing?" "I'm trying to understand something before I decide anything." "That's either very measured or genuinely alarming." "Probably both," Madeleine said, Thursday. She spent the 2 days before the gala reading property records, archived corporate filings, old news from the 90s, anything that helped her build the full picture. She asked Walter to begin preparing certain documents, not to deploy them, just to have them ready. Thursday arrived cold and clear. Madeleine wore a navy dress she'd owned for 6 years and never once worn to anything because Brendan had always said it was too understated. She wore her grandmother's small diamond earrings. She took a cab to the waterfront. The room was warm and lit, the kind of event where Toronto's cultural money dressed itself up and spent a few hours circulating in the same elegant space. Corinna found her immediately and squeezed her arm. "Table 9. She's at table 8. You'll see her from your seat." Madeleine found her table. She accepted sparkling water and looked across the room. Katrina Vale was already there, tall, composed, impeccably assembled, in the way of someone who considers presentation a professional skill rather than vanity. She was laughing at something the man beside her was saying, her attention warm and completely calibrated. She was, Madeleine had to acknowledge honestly, very good. She watched her for a long moment. And something clarified in the watching. This was not a simple story, and Katrina was not a simple villain. She was a woman who had grown up in the shadow of a loss she hadn't caused, who had converted that shadow into ambition because that believed the system that wronged them will never correct itself. Madeleine did not approve of what she had done. She thought it had caused real harm. She intended to prevent more of it. But she understood it, the way you understand things, when you stop being angry long enough to actually look. Near the end of dessert, Madeleine looked up and found Katrina already looking back at her from across the room, their eyes held for 2 full seconds. Something moved across Katrina's face, fast and unguarded, before the composed expression reassembled itself. It looked like guilt. It looked like the recognition of someone who had imagined this moment and found the reality of it more complicated than the imagining. Katrina looked away first. Madeleine stood, set her napkin on the table, and walked calmly across the room. She heard Corinna's sharp intake of breath behind her. She stopped beside Katrina's chair. Katrina looked up. The composure was back, but something beneath it was taut. "Hello, Katrina," Madeleine said. Her voice was even and quiet. "I was hoping we'd have a moment." "Madeleine," Katrina's voice steadied quickly. "I wasn't sure you'd be here tonight." "I know." She looked at this woman directly, without warmth and without threat. "When you have a few minutes, just us, there's something I think you should know." Katrina's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She was calculating. 5 minutes, she said. "That's all I need," Madeleine said. She walked back to her table. Her heart was beating hard. Her hands were completely still. 20 minutes later, Katrina appeared at her elbow. They found a quieter room at the edge of the venue. A small lounge with a window overlooking the harbor, the water dark and moving outside. Katrina closed the door and turned around. And for the first time, Madeleine saw it clearly. Behind all the polish, there was exhaustion. The deep, accumulated kind that comes from carrying something heavy for years and refusing to set it down. "What do you want?" Katrina said. "The same thing you do," Madeleine said, "the truth." Something moved through Katrina's face rapidly, surprise, then a wariness that had an old grief at the bottom of it. "I know about your grandfather," Madeleine said. "I know about the waterfront development. I know what your family believes mine did to them." "Then you know why," Katrina said. Her voice was careful but edged. "You know why any of this started." "I know where it started," Madeleine said. "I'm less certain you know how to stop." Katrina stared at her. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, "Your grandfather took what should have been my grandfather's future. My mother grew up watching her father believe he'd been made a fool of by someone he'd trusted. I grew up watching her carry that. Don't stand here and tell me this appeared from nowhere." "I'm not," Madeleine said. "I'm not diminishing any of it. What happened to your grandfather was cold. It was unfair. It caused real harm to real people across decades, and I'm not here to defend it." A pause. "I'm asking whether what you've done with Brendan is actually going to repair any of that." Katrina looked at her. Some of the edge went out of her posture, just slightly. "He was supposed to be the mechanism," she said, more quietly. "The way in. That was all it was supposed to be." "I know," Madeleine said, "and then it became something else." Katrina said nothing. "I want to show you something your grandfather was never shown," Madeleine said. She opened the leather folio she'd carried in. Inside was a photocopy, aged at the edges, the handwriting, formal and deliberate and unmistakable to anyone who had grown up reading it. A letter, dated February 1993, written by Alistair Forsythe, addressed to Reginald Hargrove. "Walter found this in my grandfather's sealed files," Madeleine said. "It was in an envelope at the back of the legal documents. No one had opened it since he placed it there." Katrina looked at the letter. She read. The letter was 4 pages. Alistair wrote about the waterfront project. He wrote about what he had known when he structured the buyout, that the zoning approval was imminent, that the appreciation he anticipated was weeks from becoming real. He wrote that he had told himself it was legal, which it was, and therefore defensible, which he had found increasingly impossible to believe. He wrote, "I treated a partner's trust as a resource to be managed rather than a responsibility to be honored. I have been living with that distinction for 6 months and find I can no longer sustain the separation between the two." He proposed a retroactive distribution, a specific figure, significant. The share Reginald would have received had he remained in the partnership to completion. He wrote, "I am not asking for your forgiveness, Reginald. I am asking for the opportunity to act like the man I should have been from the beginning." Katrina read to the last paragraph. "This letter was written in February. It has been returned to me unopened on 2 separate attempts. I have been informed through a mutual contact that Reginald suffered a serious health episode in January and is not receiving correspondence. I will try again in the spring. I will keep trying." She looked up. Her eyes were very bright. "He tried," Madeleine said quietly. "He was blocked by something neither of them chose. I don't know whether he tried enough times afterward. Walter is still looking into that, and the answer may not be what I would want it to be. But he tried. My grandfather had his first major heart attack in January of 1993, Katrina said. Her voice was flat, stripped of everything professional. He was in hospital for nearly 2 months. When he came home, he was different. He stopped talking about business entirely. He died in 1998, believing he had been abandoned by someone he had once called a friend. He never saw the letter, Madeleine said. He never saw the letter. The room was very quiet. The harbor shifted outside the window. Madeleine thought about the weight of it. Her grandfather carrying that attempted repair for years, possibly never finding another opening, telling himself the moment had passed, carrying the guilt all the way to his own grave, and Reginald Hargrove dying in the belief that no attempt had ever been made, and Katrina's mother inheriting that belief as fact, and Katrina building her entire adult life around a version of events that was both true and incomplete. He should have done more, Katrina said. 1 returned letter and 2 failed attempts. That is not enough. No, Madeleine agreed. It isn't. You're right about that. She slid a second document across the low table between them, a single page. This is a financial proposal, Madeleine said. Not a legal settlement. A recognition. What your grandfather would have received under the distribution. My grandfather proposed in 1993 with 31 years of growth applied. Katrina looked at the document. She didn't open it immediately. Why, she said. It came out carefully, like a word she was afraid to ask. Because it's the right thing, Madeleine said. Because my grandfather tried to do it, and was blocked by circumstances neither of them could control. And because someone should have done it long before now, and I am the someone who can. This has nothing to do with Brendan, Katrina said slowly. Nothing to do with what I did. This is between the Forsythe family and the Hargrove family, Madeleine said. It's 31 years old. It predates everything else. Katrina opened the folder. She read the first page. Madeleine watched her face move, through things that had no easy names, confirmation of what she'd always believed, and simultaneously the death of the absolute version of it. Because Katrina had needed Alistair Forsythe to be purely a villain, simply and completely. The truth was messier than that. The truth was a man who was sharper and colder than his partner, who had used an advantage legally but without mercy, who had spent years afterward trying to repair what he never fully could, and whose granddaughter was now sitting across from his partner's granddaughter in a room above the very waterfront, where it had all begun. Katrina closed the folder. I need time. Take it, Madeleine said. A long pause. What happens to Brendan? Katrina said. That depends on Brendan, Madeleine said. He needs to understand the real history of his company before he makes any more significant decisions about its future. I'm going to give him the chance to hear it from me. He won't take it well. People rarely take it well, Madeleine said, when the story they've built about themselves turns out to be missing chapters. But that's different from it destroying him. Katrina looked at the water outside the window. He thinks he found me, she said. He thinks all of this was natural. He has no idea any of it was constructed. I know, Madeleine said. Katrina made a sound that was almost a laugh, not a happy one. The kind that surfaces when something is too absurd and too painful and too human to respond to any other way. Madeleine stood. For what it's worth, she said plainly, without performance. I think you deserved a better inheritance than the one you received. The wound underneath all of this was real. The way you addressed it caused harm, but the wound was real. Katrina looked up at her. Her eyes were still. Madeleine nodded once, honest and direct, and walked back into the gala. She called Brendan the following morning. He picked up after 3 rings, voice carefully neutral, the tone he used when he didn't know what was coming. I need to meet with you, she said. Not about the settlement. About your company. The company is. It's not what you think it is, she said. Her voice was quiet and completely certain. There are things about how it was built that you need to understand before you make any more decisions about its future. I'm not trying to hurt you, Brendan. But you need to hear this from me. A silence, then tomorrow my office, 11. She arrived at 10:55. The boardroom, the corner one with the city view, the framed magazine, profiles on the wall, the conference table with the company name etched into the glass, told her something about his state of mind. He had put her in the impressive room. He was trying to manage his anxiety by surrounding himself with evidence of what he'd built. Brendan walked in at 11:03, looking like a man who had not slept in 2 nights, and had made every available effort to conceal it. Tell me, he said, and sat down. She told him about Greywood Capital Partners. She walked him through the structure. Precisely. The investment vehicle, the subsidiaries, the trust, the beneficiary. She set the documentation in front of him and gave him time to read. When he looked up, his face had done something she had never seen it do in 11 years. Not a collapse of expression. He held that, but a collapse of whatever had been sustaining it from the inside. You funded my company, he said. My grandfather did, she said, anonymously, through structures designed to be invisible, because he wanted to give you the tools and see what you built with them. He was watching me. He was protecting me, she said, while also, yes, watching what you would become. Brendan sat with that. I built this, he said, not aggressive, just checking, holding the claim up to see if it still held. The work was yours, she said. The decisions, the talent, the drive, all of that was yours. But the platform, Brendan, the capital that kept you operating when the market contracted, that was mine. He looked at the table, at his hands. You should have told me, he said. Yes, she said, I should have. He didn't argue. She noticed it. Somewhere in the hours since she'd called him, something had given way. She told him about Reginald Hargrove, about the waterfront buyout, the missing letter, Katrina's inherited mission, the proposed partnership, and what it actually was. She told him everything, carefully, without editorializing, without the anger she could have justifiably felt. She laid out the full picture. When she finished, the room was silent. She had a plan from the beginning, he said. A plan she'd been working toward for years, Madeleine said. It became more complicated than she intended. That doesn't excuse it, but it's true. Brendan pressed both hands flat on the table and looked out at the city, all that glass and gray and the white of the lake, to the south. He was quiet for a long time. The proposed partnership, he said finally. Greywood's approval rights, if you'd wanted to block it. I would have, she said, without you ever knowing why. But you didn't. No. Why? He said, and underneath it was the same bewilderment she had heard in Katrina's voice, the inability to locate the angle, the strategy, the self-interest that must be hiding somewhere behind the choice. Because stopping the deal doesn't fix what started this, she said, and I'm more interested in fixing things than in winning them. He looked at her then. Really looked at her, the way he hadn't in years, the way he used to before success had given him an identity to perform instead of a self to inhabit. I told you that you hadn't grown, he said. His voice had lost all its professional architecture. It was just Brendan. I said you were the same woman I'd married, like that was the problem. Like being consistent was a flaw. You did, she said. I was completely wrong, he said. I'd gotten so far into performing a version of myself that I confused losing you as an audience for losing something I didn't want. And I told myself a story about what I'd outgrown until I believed it. She said nothing. She let him have the silence. The settlement I offered you, he said, was an insult, she said, yes. Let me do it differently. He looked at her steadily. That's all I'm asking. Let me do at least that right. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. He walked her to the elevator. Before the doors closed, he said, Madeleine, whatever you're building, I hope it's something people will actually feel. The doors closed. She rode down through his building and stepped out onto Bay Street, into a Toronto November. Cold and sharp and clarifying, the kind of cold that wakes you up and reminds you that you are still entirely alive. She walked to the waterfront, the eastern waterfront, the development where 31 years ago, two men had been partners, and one had made a decision that had rippled outward further than he'd imagined. The area was transformed now, almost unrecognizable. She stood at the edge of the boardwalk and looked at the lake. The lake was vast and indifferent, and as always, good for thinking. She took out her phone and typed 5 words at the top of a blank note, what this money is for. She stood in the November cold and started writing. The Forsythe Foundation was announced publicly on a Tuesday morning in January, not through a PR firm, not through a press release drafted by committee. Madeleine wrote the statement herself, 3 paragraphs, direct and plain, in the voice she had always had and so rarely used publicly. She described the foundation's purpose: early-stage capital and operational support for developers, planners, and builders who had the skill and the vision, and simply not the floor. The networks, the inherited rooms where decisions got made before they were ever officially made. After 60 years of deliberate invisibility, the Forsythe name was attached to something, in daylight for the world to read. Corinna called within 6 minutes of the first story running. "Madeleine," she said, "it's the figure they're quoting." "Approximately correct," Madeleine said. A long pause, a very long pause. "This entire time," Corinna said, "all these years I have been your closest friend and you have been—" "Keeping a promise," Madeleine said. "The promise is over." The applications opened in February. 283 arrived in the first 2 weeks. Madeleine read every single one. Walter told her it was unsustainable at scale. She told him she would sustain it until she had a team she trusted to read them with the same attention, and then she would stay involved through their entire training period. But not before. Some of the applications made her stop and breathe. The ones that were so precise about what it felt like to have the skill and the vision and the work ethic, and simply not the foundational support, not the floor that makes everything else possible. She understood that experience differently than the people who wrote those letters did. She had been someone's invisible floor. She had been the foundation of a house whose owner never looked down to see what he was standing on. She funded 11 projects in the first cycle. She called each person herself to deliver the news. On the day of the last call, the doorbell rang. Katrina Vale was standing on the front step of the Rosedale house in a dark coat, hair down, no professional armor, just a person at a door. "I should have called first," she said. "Come in," Madeleine said. They sat in the kitchen. Madeleine made coffee. Katrina wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the table before she looked up. "I accepted the proposal," she said. "Walter's proposal, the recognition." "I know," he told me. "I also ended things with Brendan." She said it simply. "Oh, drama. What began as a strategy doesn't become real just because your feelings eventually caught up to it. He deserves someone who arrived without an agenda, and I need to learn who I am when I'm not trying to correct something." A pause. "That's going to take a while." "I imagine it will," Madeleine said. Katrina looked out the kitchen window at the frozen backyard, the maple bare, just structure, waiting for what came next. "What you did," she said quietly. "The letter. The recognition. I built a plan for a confrontation, and you refused to have it." She shook her head, not in disapproval, but in something the long carrying of something that no longer next. "My grandfather would have been glad to know someone tried, to know the letter existed." A pause. "My mother doesn't know yet. I haven't found the way to tell her." "Tell her the truth," Madeleine said. "The full, complicated version, not the clean one." "You make it sound manageable." "It isn't," Madeleine said. "But the complicated version is the only one that actually helps anyone move." They sat for a while in the quiet kitchen. Two women who had been on opposite sides of a story that neither of them had authored, in a house that had held 3 generations of choices, some honorable, some not, some that had traveled further than anyone had imagined, before finally arriving here. At the door, Katrina stopped and turned. "The foundation," she said, "the work you're describing, the people you're trying to reach." "Yes. My grandfather would have needed exactly that," she said. 40 years ago, before any of this, if something like that had existed." "I know," Madeleine said, "that's why." Katrina nodded once. She walked out into the January cold, down the front steps, and along the quiet Rosedale Street, carrying something measurably lighter than what she had arrived with. Madeleine stood in the doorway and watched her go. Then she went back inside, to the study, to the desk, where her grandfather had taught her everything that mattered. She opened her laptop. She turned to the next application, a young man from Winnipeg proposing a modular affordable housing model that 2 separate development firms had told him was too ambitious to be worth their time. She started reading. Outside the window, the city moved through its winter morning. Somewhere in it, Brendan Ashworth was rebuilding his firm on foundations he could finally see clearly, starting with a phone call to the 2 partners who had tried to tell him something was wrong and whom he had dismissed. Somewhere in it, Katrina Hargrove Vale was beginning the long and difficult work of finding out who she was, without the mission she had carried since childhood. Somewhere in it, 272 people who had sent letters to an address they'd found online were waiting to hear whether someone believed their idea was worth the risk. In a house on a Rosedale street, the woman who had been called too quiet, too unchanged, too small, for the life someone believed he had built entirely without her, that woman was reading a letter from a stranger in Winnipeg and deciding that this one deserved a chance. She had always been this person. The fortune and the name and the platform had always been hers. She had simply, at last, decided that keeping them invisible was no longer serving anyone. Her grandfather used to say, "The most sophisticated power available to a person is not the accumulation, it is the decision, made clearly, made freely, with no audience and no applause, about what you will do with it." Madeleine had made her decision. She turned the page and kept reading.